The late winter sky lay over Caliche Flats like a dulled blade, wide and pewter and cold enough to make a man speak softer. Wind flattened the needlegrass into silvered veins that ran toward the horizon and disappeared where dust met cloud. Along the north fence line, Merritt Cole rode at a patient walk, reins slack in his palm, counting staples in his head the way a monk might count prayers. The creak of leather, the thin metal song of wire, the distant thrum of a creek swollen with snow melt. These were the sounds his life kept. He had grown used to them the way a man grows used to a scar, not proud of it, not ashamed, simply the fact of him. He kept his grief trimmed close. He wore it like a second collar inside the first. Past the cottonwoods, a line shack hunkered into the lee of a dirt rise, its plank door warped, its small window gone milk-white with rime. Merritt swung down, boots whispering against wet grit, and shouldered the door with the slow care of a man who has often found nothing. The smell of old ash and damp boards rose around him. A draft moved through the place as if the house breathed. In that breath, he heard a smaller sound, soft and shivery, like a jar knocked against teeth. Not wind, not animal. A girl sat on the floor behind the stove box, knees gathered to her, hair rope wet and a shade too dark for the country. She'd wrapped herself in a threadbare shawl the color of forgotten mornings. In both hands, she held a glass vial no longer than a man's thumb, stoppered with wax and wrapped in a curl of paper gone lint blue with age. Water dripped from her hem in slow, insistent notes. She did not startle. She watched. He tipped his hat to the stove's cold iron as if to a host and then to her. "Name's Merritt Cole," he said, and left the rest behind his teeth where it belonged. He set his gloves on the table and studied the box of tinder that had been empty since last fall. The girl's eyes flicked to his hands and back again, as if weighing what kind of man kept a tidy box and an empty one in the same breath. Her voice, when it came, wore the north like frost. Ivy March. Nothing else. Merritt opened his coat and unbuttoned the pocket that kept his match tin dry. It clicked in his palm, small as a promise you make to yourself when no one is listening. He struck a light, coaxed the stove with kindling he split from a chair rung, and set the kettle to ride the first thin heat. Steam rose, frail as a foal. He could feel the room gather itself around the sound. Ivy held the vial to the stove door as if the flames could see it. "They're lilac seeds," she said, "from my mother's yard. She swore they'll take if you're patient." A small thing, held like a life. Merritt nodded toward the weather, chewing at the shack. "Patience we got plenty of," he said, and it surprised him that his voice had any warmth left to spare. He shrugged off his outer coat and draped it over a nail for later, then eased his wool blanket from his saddle roll and set it near her, not touching, the way you offer a skittish colt the smell of your hand before the weight of it. She did not reach for it. Her shiver did. While the kettle thought itself toward a boil, Merritt moved through the chores a man does on habit, checked the window latch, banked the new fire, eased open the door to judge the leaning of the wind. All the while, he kept her in the edge of his gaze. What he saw was not only cold and hunger, but a kind of held breath a person learns when the world has taught them the price of noise. He recognized it. The ranch house knew that silence in him. Some things you learn to carry by not setting them down. He poured hot water into a tin cup and swirled it over a pinch of coffee and enough sugar to cut the bite. He set it on the floor between them so she could choose it or not. After a time she did, cradling the heat with both hands and blowing at the rim. The glass vial lay across her knees like a little length of river. "Where you headed, Miss March?" he asked. Her eyes shifted toward a direction the shack did not have. "South," she said, as if the word itself might thaw something. The paper around the seeds made a faint papery murmur in the pause that followed, the sound of one last thing refusing to give up. Merritt found a chipped saucer on the shelf and placed it beside the stove. "Set it there," he said, "so it can warm some." He spoke to the seeds as much as to her. When she finally eased the vial onto the saucer, her shoulders loosened the smallest degree, as if the room had agreed to keep watch. Outside, the wind shifted, and a darker string of cloud dragged its hem over the flats. He knew then that he would ride back in the storm. He knew he would not leave her to it. Merritt fetched his horse, threw the blanket over the saddle so she could wear it, and checked the cinch twice, though it did not need it. He did not tell her the house was near enough to reach by dusk. He did not tell her what emptiness waited there. He only opened the shack door and let the cold slap his face clean, and stepped into it the way a man steps into the first sentence of the rest of his life. "Come on," he said, not unkind. "We'll keep those seeds from freezing." The wind took their words and laid them down flat across the grass. They went anyway. The road to the ranch was more suggestion than path. A narrow ribbon of mud pressed between sage and rock, made slick by the storm. The sky had sunk low enough to touch the ridge lines, gray folding into gray. Merritt rode ahead, reins looped, one hand steady on the mare's neck as Ivy clung behind him, her small hands gripping the coarse wool of his coat. She was light, too light, and her shivering reached him through the cloth like a pulse. By the time they reached the ranch, dusk had pressed its thumbprint on the land. The place was a scattering of boards and silence. Barn leaning east, corral fence missing a rail, the big house half swallowed by the hill behind it. Merritt swung down, boots squelching, and helped her from the saddle with a gentleness that startled even him. The wind dragged a shutter open and closed again. He said nothing, only opened the door and let her step first into the emptiness. Inside, the air carried the stillness of long habit. Everything smelled faintly of dust, saddle soap, and quiet. Merritt set a match to the hearth, coaxing fire from damp logs until orange washed across the floorboards. Ivy stood near the door, too polite to come closer, clutching the edge of his coat around her shoulders. She looked like a ghost trying to remember she was alive. He busied himself with small work, poured water, stripped the wet tack, hung his hat by the door. The ordinary sounds of a man moving through his own house became an odd kind of music. She followed them with her eyes as if trying to learn the tune. When he placed a tin plate of beans and bread on the table, she sat but did not eat at once. The glass vial of lilac seeds lay beside her cup. She touched it now and again, as if making sure the thing was still real. The paper around it had softened from the damp, edges curling like petals of something waiting to bloom. "You can take the loft tonight," Merritt said, nodding toward the ladder by the stove. She hesitated. "You don't know me, sir." "That's true." The fire cracked between them. "But I know the cold, and I ain't leaving anyone in it." He said it like weather, not confession. He kept his distance, one chair's width, one careful silence. She ate slow, spoon scraping the tin. When she finished, he passed her a small square of linen to dry her face. He did not look up while she did it. Outside, rain tapered to a hiss against the eaves. Somewhere in the dark, the cattle lowed, that hollow, living sound that always made him think of prayer. Ivy rose, setting the vial near the edge of the mantel where the firelight could reach it. "They need warmth," she whispered. Merritt nodded once. "So do you." She climbed to the loft with small barefoot steps, her shadow wavering across the wall like smoke. He listened until he heard the straw rustle and still. Then he sat by the hearth a long while, hat on his knee, watching the tiny glass vial shine beside the flame. He thought of his wife's grave on the north ridge, snow packed over the stone like quiet forgiveness. Thought of the prayers he'd given up shaping out loud. The seeds gleamed, not with light, but with possibility. A small, stubborn kind of hope. He poured another cup of coffee, stared into the black surface, and found himself whispering to no one, "Let her stay warm." The storm moved east through the valley, taking its noise with it, and for the first time in many years, Merritt felt the house exhale. By the time sun reached the flats again, The storm had peeled away like old paint. The world gleamed raw, new, and quiet enough that you could hear the ground sigh under each hoof. Merritt rode into town for salt, kerosene, and nails, nothing more. Yet by the time he tied up outside Brannan's General, he could already feel the talk waiting for him like a scent. Brannan's boy saw him buying a second shawl, a plain gray thing fit for warmth, and asked with a grin, "You getting soft on us, Mr. Cole?" Merritt didn't answer. He paid cash, packed the bundle, and left the store with his shoulders straight but his jaw tight. By nightfall, the story had its own legs. Folks in Caliche Flats had a way of watering rumor until it grew its own kind of truth. They said the widower Cole had found himself a drifter girl, took her in, maybe shared more than just his roof. They said she was pretty in a fragile sort of way. And wasn't it a bit soon for the man to forget his wife's grave still marked fresh on the ridge? They said all the things people say to keep from talking about themselves. Back at the ranch, Ivy didn't ask why he came home later than usual or why his eyes stayed on the horizon. She was sweeping the porch boards with a willow broom, slow, methodical, as if she'd lived there always. When she looked up, sunlight caught in her hair, that wild dark brown like scorched wheat. Merritt set the shawl beside her and said only, "Cold nights come quick out here." She touched the fabric like it might vanish. "You didn't have to." He half smiled. Maybe not. That evening she cooked supper, beans, onions, a bit of salt pork. The smell filled the house, simple but real. Merritt washed up in the basin outside, the wind tugging at his sleeves. He could hear her humming low through the open door. An old tune, unfamiliar, something northern maybe, half prayer and half memory. When he stepped back inside, the table was set for two. The glass vial sat between the plates, catching the lantern's gold light. Ivy had wound a small thread around its neck like a ribbon, a tiny act of care in a place that had nearly forgotten such things. They ate without much talk. Merritt told her about the fence line, the heifer ready to calve, and she listened like each word had weight. Afterward, she poured the rest of the coffee into the saucer near the seeds and said, "Warm water wakes them. Mama used to say patience is a kind of love." Merritt didn't answer right away. The fire snapped once and threw sparks up the chimney. He thought about that word, love, and how it had become something you handle with gloves. "Still," he said quietly, "then maybe they'll wake fine here." Outside, coyotes barked across the valley. The sound carried all the way to town, where tongues were still wagging, where somebody was surely saying the rancher had finally gone soft or crazy or both. But Merritt Cole didn't mind. The girl upstairs slept under his roof, and that small glass vial sat between them like a candle refusing to die. He sat a long while after she'd gone to bed, watching the fire's light move over the lilac seeds. There was something in the silence, not loneliness now, but waiting. The kind a man feels before the first blossom breaks through the frost. Morning came soft and slow, pale light slipping through the slats of the porch as if unsure of its welcome. The storm had washed everything clean. Fence posts gleamed dark with moisture, and the field steamed under the first shy sun. Merritt stepped outside to feed the horses, breath fogging before him. The air smelled of thawing earth and wet cedar, like a wound deciding to heal. When he came back in, Ivy was kneeling near the hearth, sleeves rolled, scrubbing the floor with water gone gray in the bucket. Her hair was tied back with a strip of calico, and a strand had worked free against her cheek. The movement of her arm was steady, not hurried, as if she'd found in work the one language she could still trust. Merritt watched a moment before speaking. "You don't owe this house a shine," he said. She didn't look up. "No, sir, but it feels better when things are clean." He nodded once. "Can't argue that." When she rose, her skirt hem was damp, but her face was calm. Color warmed back into it. She'd left biscuits cooling on the sill, small, round, and uneven. Merritt bit into one, crumbly, sweet, in a plain way. and said nothing. But she saw him finish the second and allowed herself a quiet smile that lasted only a breath. Outside, the prairie lay silent, except for the faint sound of wind dragging itself through the grass. Ivy came out to hang the blankets across the rail. Merritt passed her a tin of nails without thinking, and she took it, careful not to brush his hand. In that small exchange, something wordless flickered, trust trying its legs. By noon, she had stitched a patch into his work shirt using thread pulled from the hem of her own dress. He found it later, folded on the chair by the stove, mended and washed. A small note lay atop it. Didn't have blue thread, so I used mine. It's strong enough. That evening he set a chipped saucer by the stove and placed the lilac vial upon it, same as before, but this time he filled the saucer with warm water. "Let him rest a spell," he said. Ivy nodded, watching as the tiny seeds rolled against the glass like thoughts still deciding whether to live. Later, while the fire hummed low, she asked softly, "Was your wife a patient woman?" Merritt turned the question in his hands like a coin too worn to spend. "She was quiet," he said at last. "Liked to hum while she made soap, never asked for much." Ivy studied the flames. "Sounds like she loved steady." He gave a faint nod. "Steady's rare." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It sat easy, the way two people might share a porch bench without speaking of what hurt them. Outside, the clouds had cleared, leaving the stars sharp enough to cut. Ivy went to bed in the loft, and Merritt stayed by the fire a while longer. He took the mended shirt into his lap, traced the neat hand stitch with a thumb. The blue thread caught the light. Strong indeed. He looked at the glass vial, the seeds half floating in warm water. It seemed almost to breathe in the flicker of the fire. He thought of how small things took root when no one was watching. He thought of Grace. When he finally banked the coals and climbed the stairs to his narrow bed, he heard her whisper through the dark, barely above the creak of timber. "Good night, Mr. Cole." He waited a long moment before answering. "Good night, Miss March." The words hung there, simple, clean, and new as morning. By late March, the sky had begun to forget itself. Mornings came mild as a promise, but by noon the wind rose wild from the north, dragging sleet like teeth across the land. Merritt knew the signs. He could smell a hard storm hours before it broke. He spent the day running fence and checking the low crossings where the creek liked to play tricks come thaw. When he returned, the clouds were already gathering, long dark ropes twisting above the flats. He found Ivy on the porch, clutching her shawl tight, eyes on the horizon. The wind pressed the hem of her dress against her legs and stole her breath before she could speak. He didn't need her to. He knew that look, fear too old for her years. Inside, he poured lamp oil and trimmed the wick. "It'll come quick," he said. "Storm'll rattle us some, but she'll pass." Ivy nodded, though her hands betrayed her, trembling against the fabric. When thunder rolled, low and patient like an old grudge, she flinched. The cup in her hands clicked against the table. "You all right?" he asked. Voice quiet. "Fine," she lied, eyes down. The wind thickened until it screamed through the chimney, shaking loose a cough of soot. Merritt went to the window, saw the rain beginning, a silver sheet over the corral. He latched the shutters, tested each one, and felt her gaze on his back. When he turned, she was standing by the fire, the vial of seeds pressed against her chest. "I don't like thunder," she whispered. "Storm won't hurt you in here." "It's not the storm I remember." She said nothing else, but her eyes told what her mouth could not. Memory of another place, another night, and voices that had not stopped with the rain. Merritt moved slow, pulling another log from the pile. "My wife, she used to sit by that same fire when lightning came. Said it sounded like the world arguing with itself." He eased the log in. "But it never won." Ivy gave a faint, uncertain laugh. "Maybe your wife was braver than me." He shook his head. "Bravery's just patience dressed different." The storm hit full then. Rain driving sideways, the house moaning at the seams. The lantern swung, casting shadows that climbed the walls like restless spirits. Merritt fetched extra blankets, spread one near the hearth, and gestured toward it. She hesitated, then knelt, drawing the shawl around her shoulders. Hours passed that way. Him mending a bridle by the firelight, her watching the flames as if they could explain something. Every now and then lightning tore the sky open, and she'd flinch again. Once, when a sharp crack split the rafters, she rose without thinking and came to stand beside him. Close enough that he could smell the rain in her hair. He didn't move, didn't speak, just kept threading the leather. When the thunder rolled again, softer this time, she exhaled. "Thank you," she said, not for the blankets, not for the fire, but for the silence that expected nothing. He looked up from his work. "Ain't done much." "You didn't ask," she said. "That's enough." Outside, the sleet turned to snow, whitening the edges of the world. Inside, the last log burned low, leaving only the small hiss of sap. Ivy set the glass vial on the mantel, where it caught the flicker and glowed faintly, like something still believing in spring. Merritt watched her there, shadow and fire mingling, and thought how storms never came to ruin everything. Sometimes they just cleared the air. By morning, the world lay hushed and glassy under a thin crust of snow. The storm had broken clean, leaving behind a strange stillness that felt almost holy. Smoke lifted from the chimney in a single white thread. Merritt split wood in the yard while Ivy poured coffee, both of them quiet as the sky, but the peace didn't hold. Some silences aren't empty. They're waiting. That afternoon, a trader wagon rolled past the ranch, canvas wet, wheels biting deep into the mud. Merritt hailed them down for news of fence wire, but the driver, an old man with river eyes, leaned close and said, "You got company soon. That prayer camp from up north's been asking after a girl travels alone. Say she ran off with their holy property." The words hung there like frost. Merritt said nothing, just nodded once and let the wagon move on. But the lines around his mouth deepened. Inside, Ivy had gone pale. "They're near?" she asked, voice thin as paper. He didn't ask how she knew. "Could be talk." "It's never just talk," she said. She stood near the stove, fingers twisting her shawl, that small vial of lilac seeds glinting at her collar. Her eyes had gone distant, drawn toward something she didn't want to remember. He waited. "They said we were chosen," she began, voice barely more than breath. "They came through last autumn, set their tents by the river, called it the Camp of the Pure, said the Lord had told them to gather those who'd lost their way." She smiled without warmth. They were good at finding the lost. Merritt's jaw tightened. He stared into the fire, hearing her words as if from underwater. "They gave me a cot, a dress, a verse to say before sleep. Then the preacher started visiting after prayers." Her hand trembled as she lifted the vial. "He said I was the soil and he was the seed, and that if I doubted, I'd never bloom." The words cracked somewhere near the end. Merritt looked up. The firelight cut across his face, deepening the lines time had carved there. He said nothing at first. Words could wound where silence could hold. Then, slow and even, "You ain't property, not to any man, preacher or otherwise." Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but something harder. Defiance, maybe. "They'll come for me. Then they'll find no welcome here," he said. Outside, the wind turned cold again, carrying the cry of a hawk. The sound echoed through the barn rafters and died there, sharp as a nail. Merritt moved to the window, scanning the flats. "We'll keep watch tonight." Ivy hesitated, then crossed the room and set the vial back on the mantel. Her hands lingered there. "You believe things can grow in this land?" she asked quietly. He looked at the fields beyond the porch, bare, colorless, sleeping under snow. "Maybe not quick," he said, "but roots take even when no one's watching." She nodded. that faint trembling easing from her shoulders. When night fell, he pulled his chair between her and the door. No words passed, only the creak of the old clock, the soft hiss of wood settling in the stove. Ivy sat by the fire, her eyes following the curl of smoke as if tracing the shape of freedom. And there, between them, the space of one heartbeat and a lifetime, something shifted. Not love, not yet. Just a quiet understanding that both had run from ghosts, and somehow, here, the ghosts had stopped at the threshold. The lilac seeds gleamed faintly in the firelight, waiting for spring. The storm had left the world softened but treacherous. By the second night, the wind came again, this time warm, restless, a whisper out of season that carried trouble in it. Merritt felt it in his bones before the sky changed. He rose before dawn, saddle creaking under him, and found the lower fence half drowned. The creek had swollen with meltwater, brown and fast, carrying branches and dead grass like offerings to some unseen god. Down in the meadow, the young cattle had drifted too near the bank. One wrong move and the whole lot could vanish. He called for Ivy to stay in the house, but she was already pulling on her boots, hair loose from sleep. "You'll need a light," she said, reaching for the lantern before he could stop her. "It's freezing rain." "You'll freeze with it." She just met his eyes. "I've been colder." They rode out under a sky the color of tin, lantern swinging from her hand, flame trembling in the wind. Rain fell in needles, slicing against their cheeks. By the time they reached the pasture, the ground had turned to soup, hooves sinking to the fetlocks. The yearlings bawled in confusion, clustered by the downed section of fence. Merritt dismounted, boots vanishing in the muck. "Hold that light steady." She nodded, jaw tight. The lantern's glow danced against the wet air, golden against the chaos. He waded into the water, rope over his shoulder, coat dragging heavy. The current fought him, snatching at his legs. Behind him, Ivy's voice cut through the wind. "There's one! By the oak!" He turned just in time to see a small steer stumble, legs folding as the ground gave way beneath it. Without thinking, Merritt dropped the rope and lunged, catching the calf's halter and pulling hard. The mud sucked and pulled, the water rising. The lantern light swung wildly, throwing fractured circles across the dark. Then the wind caught it. The flame flared once and died. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but black water and the sound of the storm. "Merritt!" Ivy's voice broke through. She stumbled toward the creek, blind, the rain turning her shawl to lead. He heard her splash once, twice, until she found him by the rope and grabbed his sleeve. Together they pulled, the calf scrambling up the slope, bawling as it found ground. He turned to her, soaked, shaking, breath visible in quick bursts. "You could have been swept clean away." "So could you," she said. He looked at her then, truly looked. The rain had plastered her hair to her face. The mud streaked up her arms, but her eyes were fierce, alive in a way he hadn't seen since before the winter took his wife. "Lantern's gone," he muttered. "I'll fetch another," she said, and before he could answer, she lifted a corner of his coat, tore it free, and stuffed it with dry grass from the bank. With flint from his saddlebag, she struck a spark. The tiny fire leapt in her hands, cupped against the wind, fragile but refusing to die. Merritt stared at her, half in awe. "You just burned a month's worth of feed to make light." Her voice trembled. "Light's worth more." They stayed until dawn, tending the herd, the makeshift fire glowing low beside them. When the rain finally eased, the world smelled of smoke and thawing earth. Merritt stood, water dripping from his hat brim, and looked east where the sun began to climb. Ivy sat on a rock, soaked to the bone, watching the sky as if it were something holy. He wanted to speak, but found no words that fit. Instead, he reached down and helped her to her feet. Their hands met, cold, rough, human. She didn't let go right away. By the time they reached the ranch, the world had gone still again. In the gray half-light of morning, Merritt saw the lilac seeds resting on the mantel, and it struck him. They'd survived the storm too. Some things were meant to. The storm broke into sunlight, leaving the flat slick and shining, puddles bright as mirrors. For 2 days the air stayed calm, as if the land were catching its breath. Merritt patched the fence, hammered new posts into the softened earth, and told himself the worst had passed. But trouble travels quiet. On the third morning a rider came through, a mail carrier from the north. He tipped his hat at Merritt and asked offhand, "You still keeping that stray girl? There's a preacher been asking down the trail, says she's his kin, calls her Evelyn or some such. Says she's gone wild and needs bringing back." Merritt's shoulders stiffened. "Don't know any Evelyn," he said, and the man nodded, not pressing it. Still, the words sat between them like grit in a wound. When the rider left, Merritt stood a long while watching the road where dust settled back slow, already knowing what Ivy would decide. That evening she packed in silence. The house smelled of biscuits and rain, and her footsteps made no sound on the boards. The glass vial lay empty on the table. The seeds planted in a wooden box near the window, their soil dark and moist. "I can't have you ruined by me," she said quietly. "They twist stories. They'll make you the sinner and me the fool." He leaned against the door frame, arms crossed, hat in hand. "I've been both before. Don't scare me much." Her eyes glistened. "You don't understand what they do to women who leave, the lies they tell. I don't care about their talk." "You should." She lifted her bundle. "This is your land, your name. I won't stain it." Merritt looked at her for a long moment, the shawl tight around her shoulders, the hair coming loose again. She seemed smaller now, as if already halfway gone. "You could stay," he said. "Paper can fix talk." Her brow furrowed. "Paper?" He nodded once. "Marriage license. County clerk rides through on Fridays." The silence that followed was deep enough to feel. The fire popped. Outside, a horse whickered. "You'd marry a girl you don't even—" He stopped her with a look, steady, unhurried. "I know enough. You're decent. You work hard. You keep that house warmer than any fire I've had in years." Ivy's throat moved as she swallowed. "They won't believe it's honest. They don't need to." For a moment she wavered, the light catching the glass vial on the table. Sunlight broken through the last of the clouds. Her eyes followed it, then lifted to him. "You'd do that? For me?" He said it plain, no tremor in the words. "For peace." She stood very still, bundle pressed to her chest. Then she set it down, slow as prayer. "All right," she whispered, "but I'll ride beside you, not behind." Merritt's mouth twitched into the smallest smile. "You got it." They left at dawn, the trail still damp, the hills rimmed in gold. The county clerk's wagon waited where the road bent toward town, a lean man in spectacles, more curious than surprised. He filled the papers, took their signatures, and stamped them with a steel seal that bit the page like destiny. When it was done, Ivy stared at her name written beside Merritt's, the ink still wet. She traced it with her finger, slow and trembling. "What now?" she asked. "Now we go home," he said. As they rode back, the sun broke clean across the plains, and the air smelled of lilac, though none yet bloomed. Ivy turned once in the saddle to look behind her, toward the north where the prayer camp had been. Nothing there but wind and distance. The past, finally too far to follow. They reached Caliche Flats before sundown. The air hung heavy with that late spring sweetness that makes the heart ache a little. The creek had fallen back into its banks, quiet now, as if ashamed of what it had nearly taken. Merritt unsaddled in silence while Ivy carried the marriage paper inside, folding it neat beside the seeds. But word moves quicker than horses. By morning, the town already knew. The blacksmith said it first, half laugh, half sneer, how the widower Cole had tied himself to some wandering sinner. The storekeeper's wife called it pity gone foolish. Even Brannan's boy, the one who'd seen Merritt buy the shawl, told the mail carrier, "Guess he bought a wife, not a blanket." Merritt heard none of it firsthand, but he felt the weight of it in every silence when he rode through town for supplies, every sideways glance that tried to measure his shame. He kept his hat low, spoke only what was needed, and went home to the wide hush of the flats. Ivy felt it too. You could see it in the way she lingered near the porch, afraid to wander far. Once, when he came back from the pasture, she asked, "Does it bother you, what they say?" He took off his gloves slow. "If I worried about gossip, I'd have died of it years ago. They'll never believe it was for love." "Then let 'em believe it was for mercy." Her eyes met his. And was it? He paused, looking past her to where the lilac box sat by the window, a faint green thread just breaking the soil. "Started that way," he said. "Don't reckon it stayed." The days lengthened, and spring crept forward, quiet as a secret. The snowmelt fed the grass, the calves grew bold, and the air smelled less of frost, more of dust and sun. Merritt caught himself watching Ivy at odd moments, hanging wash, reading aloud from an old hymnal, humming when she thought he wasn't near. There was a peace in it, though not the kind a man could name. One evening he found her standing in the garden patch, apron smeared with earth, the first lilac seedling rising fragile beside her hand. The light struck her face through the leaves, gold and trembling. "They're taking," she said softly. He nodded. "Told you they would." That night, when the sky burned down into violet, she came to him on the porch, holding the glass vial, empty now, washed clean. She turned it in her fingers, the firelight catching in it like memory. "You gave up a quiet life for me," she said. He looked at her a long moment before answering. "Quiet's overrated." For a heartbeat she smiled, small, honest, like sunlight breaking through dust. But the peace didn't last. The next morning a rider came from town, a deputy with hat in hand, polite but uneasy. "Cole," he said, "there's talk from the preacher's camp up north. They're still looking for that girl. Might come down this way once the river crossing clears." Merritt's face didn't change. "They'll find nothing worth taking here." The deputy nodded but lingered. "Town'll be watching, though. Folks like a scandal better than a sunrise." When he rode off, Ivy stood by the doorway, eyes dark, fingers clutching the edge of her apron. "They'll never stop, will they?" He stepped beside her, resting a calloused hand over hers. "Maybe not." He looked out across the open flats, wind rippling through the tall grass like a slow sea. "But the land forgets quicker than people. We'll outlast their talk." That night, she pressed the empty vial into the soil beside the lilac sprout and covered it with her palm. "Let them grow," she whispered. "Let something in this place stay clean." Merritt stood behind her in the doorway, lantern light painting his face in gold and shadow. The house felt different then. Not empty, not lonely, just alive with quiet defiance. Outside, the wind carried the smell of rain and new earth. The lilac leaves trembled, as if listening. By the last week of spring, dawn began earlier and stayed longer, softening the hard lines of the flats. The house, once hollow as a bell, now breathed like something alive. Ivy woke before Merritt, as she often did, the first light catching her hair where it spilled across the pillow. She rose quietly, poured water for the seedlings, and opened the windows to let in the cool air that smelled of grass and wood smoke. Outside, a thin mist drifted over the pasture, ghosts without malice. Merritt was already there, leaning on the fence rail, hat brim low. The world around him glowed pale gold. When she joined him, he didn't turn right away. He just said, "Listen." The sound of the creek reached them, steady, untroubled. No storm now, no threat, only movement. Somewhere far off, a meadowlark sang its first broken song of the morning. They won't come, he said quietly. That preacher's lot. Creek took the crossing clean out, camp's gone, folded like wet canvas. Ivy's breath caught. You're sure? He nodded. Ryder from town told me last night. Folks moved east. No one's looking anymore. For a long time, she said nothing. Then, softer than the wind. So it's over. He looked at her then, truly looked, and saw that the fear that had once lived behind her eyes had gone out like a storm lamp with no more oil to burn. What was left was calm. Back inside, she checked the lilac box. The first buds had pushed through the dark soil, tiny and green, curling toward the light. She touched one leaf with her fingertip and smiled, half in disbelief. They took root, she whispered. Merritt crouched beside her, the boards creaking under his weight. Told you they just needed patience. Her hand rested over his for a breath too long. And kindness, she said. He looked at her, the shawl worn thin but warm, the earth on her wrists, the quiet in her eyes, and something in him eased for good. He realized the house no longer sounded like an echo. It sounded like home. That evening, as the sun fell low, Ivy stepped onto the porch with a tin mug of coffee and leaned against the post where he often stood. The fields burned copper, and the lilac shoots by the window caught the light like small green flames. Merritt came up beside her, brushing the dust from his hands. Neither spoke. There was no need. In the hush between day and night, a small wind came through, stirring the air, carrying the faintest scent of lilac long before any bloom had opened. It was enough. When darkness settled, Merritt reached for the lantern and set it on the rail. Its glow spilled over her face, soft and sure. She turned toward him, eyes glimmering, and said only, "We made it through." He nodded once. "We did." They stood there a long while, two figures in the gold light, watching the horizon swallow the last of the sun. Behind them, the house creaked in contentment, and the earth, patient as grace, held their silence kindly.